Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Scheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes in from my guest, in this case, Melissa Camacho. Is that pronounced correctly?
It
Camacho?
is.
Yes, who is the senior staff attorney at the Los Angeles County ACLU, no, Southern California
Yes.
ACLU. I should know that. It's a legendary chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, once run by the great Ramona Ripston, who did so much. But I'm here to talk about a report, a judicial decision. I notice it's temporary, but the way the Los Angeles Times described it in the story last Friday was LA County and ACLU reach what they put in quote marks extraordinary agreement to address jail conditions. Address jail conditions. So I read this story and I thought, wait a minute, this is Los Angeles. This is California. This is the deep blue state. This is where people brag about having been in the civil rights movement. And just going by what the LA County uh, report said, for example, as part of the proposed settlement, this is to control the sheriff's department, which administers the county jail. And quoting from the LA Times, as part of the proposed settlement, which still requires court approval, the county agreed to limits on how long detainees can be held at the inmate reception center in downtown as well LA, as well as how long inmates can be handcuffed or tethered to chairs and benches there. And then, what was the great agreement? They said you can only be detained to an object for 4 hours.
Right.
Only how long can you be held in the jail? In this latest agreement, you can be held for what, 24 hours or something? What was it? Uh,
Right.
uh, and the conditions, the description is just startling. Um, what I want to know, this is a lawsuit that began a half century ago, right? In
Yes.
Los Angeles County. Supposedly, I mean, I know most of these supervisors. I've been around a long time. I worked at the LA Times for almost 30 years. I knew these supervisors. They all seemed to be great liberals, most of them. I think there would generally be one who was a kind of a cranky Republican on the board of supervisors, but they all seemed very enlightened. I voted, I guess, for all of them. And how have they gone along for a half century with conditions? Maybe you can describe those conditions, but in the LA Times story, they're absolutely horrendous. Uh, your statement accused the county of flouting even court orders by chaining inmates to benches and gurneys for hours at a time, locking people in cells covered with trash and feces, and leaving them to sleep on crowded intake center floors with nothing but plastic bags to keep warm. Uh, Tell us what is going on. Is not Mississippi back in the '60s or something, right?
Right. This is right in
You
our backyard.
today. You go
Yes.
into those jails. So tell me, well, what is this all about, and why does the community of Southern California largely not even know about this, and why did it take a half century to address?
Yes. So the lawsuit that you referenced was first filed in the ACLU 2 years before I was born, back in 1975. Interestingly enough, it was filed against the Board of Supervisors and the Sheriff's Department as the two entities who have the power and authority over the LA County jails. At that time, Kenneth Hahn was one of the supervisors. So we are on our second generation of Hans now as defendants in this very long lasting case. Now, sorry,
Well,
go
take
ahead.
us through a half century before you were born. I mean, we're not. This is. I mean, we're not talking about ending slavery or ending segregation. We're talking. I mean, a lot of these people have mental health problems. I mean,
Yes.
one of your victories
Mhm.
is you can. You have to tend to mental health people. There's something very positive in that. There's supposed to be a swing to not necessarily locking everybody up. For people who don't know LA, we have the most horrendous homeless problem in the world. And when I say homeless, a problem that is horrendous, I don't mean horrendous that it's an inconvenience to people who are going to offices and shopping. Certainly it is that, but that's not the profound inhumanity of it. We have
Mhm.
people living in miles and miles. I drive from my home downtown to USC and back at night, and I sometimes take the streets that are less crowded. My goodness, you have these hordes of humanity there. And basically, correct me if I'm wrong, what your thing addresses is that incarceration has been the main form of mental health. These people
Yes.
very often cannot stand trial, don't know what they're doing, or so forth, and yet they're going to be locked up, and obviously their mental condition is going to be made all the worse.
Right. And not only that, but there has literally been no place to put them. So, the Inmate Reception Center is the subject of the most recent settlement that you referenced. And that's the intake center for the 6 jails in LA County that are referred to as the men's facility. So, there is one more facility that is for designated for women in Linwood. And that has its own intake center. So this particular inmate reception center is just for the six facilities where people who are going to be housed in male designated facilities go through. So you have to get processed through, and you're supposed to get processed quickly within 24 hours. And some of that is back to that 1975 case. One of the big wins from that case was requiring the county and the sheriff's department to give everybody a mattress when they came in to the jail and have to spend the night. So that's why you have to move through the IRC within 24 hours, because there's no beds in the IRC. It's purely a processing center. You're there to see medical, to see what your medical needs are. You're there to see mental health, to
What
see
does
what your,
IRC stand for?
the inmate reception center.
Ah,
So you're there to see medical, you're there to see mental health. You have to wait until housing classification figures out where you're going to be placed. And the problem that you mentioned is that in LA County, the jails have become this de facto place of putting people with mental illness who have no place to go. The problem is there's also no place to put them in the jail. Was literally no space in the places designated as either high observation housing for people with very significant mental illness or medium observation housing for people with significant mental illness who require a higher level of observation. So people were coming into the IRC, but there was no place, no, especially no mental health housing for them to go. So they were getting stuck in the IRC for days at a time. And those who were the sickest were stuck on the front bench, chained to the front bench for literally 24, 48, 72. I talked to somebody who had been on the front bench for 99 hours. I
okay, so
saw,
let's put people what we're talking about.
sure.
We're talking about being chained to a bench.
Mhm.
Maybe you're talking to yourself. Maybe you screamed at someone. Maybe you stole something. Whatever you did, uh, in the case of profoundly mentally disturbed people, they don't even know why they're there or what have
Right,
you.
right.
And they're going to be chained. Could you? I want people listening to this to understand. We're talking about here. I've got a desk. I'm chained to this desk for 24 hours.
They're basically they're chairs that are hard plastic chairs, that have kind of waist chains and handcuffs attached to the chairs. So the person is handcuffed and then chained with the on the waist chain, which is attached to the chair. It's loosely chained. So often when I would go, I would see people who are still chained to the chair, but choosing to lie down on the floor because at least there's a little bit more space to try and get some sleep. But I also very frequently saw people laying in puddles of their own urine. We would get reports of people basically relieving themselves also with feces on the ground. I witnessed one person stand up and try and pee into an orange juice carton. Because when you're on the front bench, you have no freedom of movement to go out to the bathroom when you need to use the
And
bathroom.
what if you say to the guard, I need the bathroom?
Apparently, they weren't being taken out to use the bathroom every time they needed to go.
Okay.
And then some people are also detoxing and in a difficult enough space that, possibly it wasn't possible to even ask in time.
Okay, so let me, I really don't actually know how to comprehend this. Tonight, I'll probably go to the Mercado de Palermo, this community center near the Department of Motor Vehicles. There'll be a lot of sheriff's offices, police offices, and so forth. They'll be eating. They seem like nice people. We have a racially changed and gender changed department of law enforcement. We have, I think, even a majority. Do we have now of Latino, Hispanic people? I don't know, or non-white. We have, you know, those battles have actually been won. We have many more women, and it's not just men and
Mhm.
so forth, all sorts of cool things. And I'll be breaking bread with these people. And
Yes.
I'll think they kept human beings who, by the way, may be totally innocent of anything. Not
Right.
that we allowed or should be allowed to treat any human being this way, but these are people who have been picked up and they could be innocent. They were just screaming on a street corner or something in this homeless nightmare that we have there. And I saw the picture in the LA Times. They show these sheriffs all standing around being indifferent to human beings on the ground, peeing on themselves and screaming and everything.
Mhm.
So, what do we make of this? From you are a human being, a lawyer by training. You go in there. Do you ever just say to these deputies, Why are you standing by? Why
Yes.
can't you fix this?"
Yeah. Both to the deputies and to the staff in charge. I think last summer, when the problem raised itself again more recently, one of my frustrations was that I didn't feel that sheriff's department staff or the board of supervisors were treating it as an emergency situation. In June, somebody died. An elderly man was came into the IRC and did not have a medical evaluation before he died at the IRC. When it's that overcrowded and that packed, things go wrong very fast. And it was sad, frustrating that we had to go back to court to ask the court to get involved before we saw real movement from the Board of Supervisors. And why I sort of point the finger at the Board of Supervisors is that the root of the problem in the IRC, as I mentioned earlier, is the lack of housing. Uh, and that's with very, very full jails. Our LA County jails are authorized to hold around 12,400 people, but they consistently operate above that level. 14,000, 15,000. Before COVID, it was up to 17,000. And you just cannot process that many people through the IRC. And so our pressure was on the board of supervisors to say, you have this overcrowding problem. It's largely caused by putting people with significant mental illness in jail pre-trial rather than creating a robust community system where people can actually have their symptoms treated pre-trial so that they can break the cycle of people going into jail for doing things like vandalism, felony vandalism, trespassing, different things people are getting picked up for. They're largely, the root is mental illness and not some like inherent criminality.
And the fact of the matter goes to a basic issue of human rights. If they are mentally ill to the point where they don't comprehend where they are or how to defend themselves or what's going on, come on. This is the barbarism that used to, in the old days, be exposed in movies. And then most often we try to attribute it to other cultures. And I
Mhm.
want to get back to these supervisors. I knew Han's father, I guess, a bit. There's a nice park named after him. A lot of buildings named after him, and I guess his son will have the same. And as I said, I've interviewed a lot of these people over the years. I was at the LA Times, 29 years, and I'm reading this story. I don't know why this story got to me in a way very few have.
Mm,
That this has been going on for 50 years. And
yes.
first of all, it has to do with the criminalization of poverty, the
Yes.
criminalization of mental illness. What are we talking about? These are people who are innocent
Hmm.
at this moment, right? And
Right.
they have not had any day in court, or on this occasion at least. And yet, how do how would I, if I were a supervisor, just go out and have dinner that night or go home and have dinner having witnessed this? Now, do the supervisors ever actually witness it? Because the sheriff's department, for people who don't come from LA,
Hmm.
might not know, it's a sort of a power unto itself. We have an
Right.
elected sheriff, we've had sheriffs accused of criminality, of racism, and everything else. But the fact is, they're supposed to, even the county said in a release Friday, this is the county, these are basically progressive Democrats in a self-defined. In
Hmm.
a release Friday, this is the LA Times, the county highlighted progress officials have already made, saying they have announced bonuses for jail healthcare workers, added a compliance sergeant position in the inmate reception center, and retrained staff on legal requirements and wait times. That sounds like a lot of garbage to me. I mean, what are we talking about? This is a problem in one form or another that the courts have been addressing, and the ACLU has been raising
Hmm.
for half a century. So, how do you keep? You seem to have a great sense of calm, and I want to ask you, you were in the jail just today, right? We
I was, and I was in the IRC yesterday. I have a little bit of calm because it is night and day different yesterday than it was last summer. So far, some of the changes they've put in place are really working. But I also want to highlight their population is down. They've actually started moving people to state prison, moving people who need treatment to state hospitals, and I hope that when their reporting on the settlement comes out, they'll be showing that they're rolling out more community beds to the Office of Diversion and Reentry, and that's why we're seeing the numbers starting to come down. I mentioned before our BSCC rating is 12,400. We're down to 12,800, so spitting distance, which is the first time in a long time.
what does that rating refer to?
It's called the Board of State and Community Corrections, is the government entity in California that rates the capacity levels
Oh,
of the jails all over, up and down every county in California. And so in LA County, our jails are rated to be able to hold 12,400. And like I said, we're about 400 over, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the changes.
okay, but
But
and
mhm,
I do want to applaud. Look, first of all, without people like you, without the ACLU,
mhm, mhm,
we wouldn't be making this progress. I don't know why I'm giggling. I just find it so absurd. And then I
right.
remind myself, we're talking about a human being chained to a chair. What, for hours and hours and hours? I read that story and I said, wait a minute, they could be in that a chair for days.
Mhm. Yes.
I mean, how do you stay? If you weren't crazy to begin with, you go
You
nuts
are
then.
now.
I mean,
Yes. Yes.
what are we talking about? But I do want to applaud that progress can be made, and I want to connect this to the larger issue of homelessness and so
Mhm.
forth, because in Los Angeles now, and certainly up in Northern California, San Francisco, and so forth, this is even from a strict economics prosperity notion
Mhm.
recognized now as destructive of civic life, of community life. I
Mhm.
mean, it's just crazy.
Mhm.
Now the Skid Row in Los Angeles last night, I noticed it went past ramparts. It went, I mean, I was driving around in preparation for this talk, but I also happened to be in the community. And I
Mhm.
thought, my goodness, any illusion that
Mhm.
this is somehow getting better,
Right.
and the only serious way it's being treated, in fact, even in your proposal, it would
Mhm.
only be uh, through the judicial system that people end up getting housing,
Right.
right? Often these people are become socially irritating or disruptive or a nuisance or whatever because they don't have any normalcy of life. We know we have a problem where it's almost impossible to rent a place to live in with any kind of reasonable rental and so forth.
Mhm.
And we have, let's be clear about this, in blue state California has by far the most severe homeless problem.
Mhm.
And whether you like it or not, it's a problem for everybody.
Right.
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 But focusing as you do on the people, they have just been criminalized.
Right.
Reading this whole report that you people prepared and so forth, with the real issue here, and your solution, unfortunately, it's a good one, but it's very limited, is to create some, what is it, 500? I have the figures here. 500 non carceral, I guess that means non jail beds for people found incompetent to stand trial. This is a city of what, 12? I mean, this county
Right.
of 12 million people.
Yes.
And we are now going to, they've agreed, the county, that they will create more than, let's give them the more than, 500 non carceral beds for people found incompetent to stand trial.
Right.
Now, every major religion, every major philosophical construction would tell you this is immoral, that if somebody is incompetent and doesn't know where they are and doesn't know what they're doing, to treat them as a prisoner
Mhm.
and to only talk about punishment is, first of all,
Mhm.
going to make the problem much worse. We have a vast literature on that. And we also know by any decent standard it's immoral.
Right.
Yet, and I'm not faulting you because you represent the solution rather than the problem. I looked at that headline and it said extraordinary agreement. That's the word
Yes,
from.
I think why the word extraordinary is used, and part of it is those 500 beds, is that this is the first time, for sure, in our lawsuit, and even really around the country, where we've gotten a county to agree to non-jail solutions to fix a jail problem. So the 500 beds are part of 1,900 beds that the county has committed to rolling out online that are not beds in the jail, but rather beds where people in the community can receive the support, housing, mental health services while they're pretrial instead of being in jail. And part of why we were able to do that in this case goes back about 8 years or so, when the board was considering what to do with this growing population of people with mental illness that were coming into the jails. They actually originally proposed building a new mental health jail. And community leaders from throughout LA County joined together to convince the board not only should they not build a jail, because jails is never an answer for people with mental illness, but they should also close kind of the worst offending facility in our county, Men's Central Jail. So the movement there, which is largely led by a coalition called Justice LA, was successful in getting the board to commit to not building that jail and to close Men's Central Jail. And as part of that effort, then the board asked for various studies. Well, how can we accomplish this? And Rand came back a couple of years ago with a report given straight to the Board of Supervisors saying that roughly 60% of people who were currently in the jails could be safely treated outside of the jail walls.
What was the percentage?
60.
60.
Yes, so nearly two-thirds. 60% of people with mental illness could be safely treated outside of the jails in community. And again, with hope of actually getting
And
better.
unquestionably, they're going
Right.
to be made worse in the jail.
Exactly.
I mean, it's all,
Right.
paranoia and everything
Mhm.
is enhanced. And I want to get to that. I actually once interviewed Ronald Reagan about all this
Mhm.
when he before he was governor and then when he was governor. And I must say, even then, I mean, even Ronald Reagan, whatever you think about him, he thought by closing down, and that's something, by the way, the ACLU favored also, the big mental hospitals, the big asylums and so forth, was a humane thing to do.
Mhm.
We had drugs that could now help people, that they
Mhm.
would get. We could have smaller community facilities. It would be a budget saver. I
Mhm.
forget, it was the Landon Petrus Act and so forth. That failed miserably, part somewhat because people didn't participate. You know, if they're having mental problems, they might not show up, but also communities didn't want it, NIMBYism and so forth. And however it happened, we are now visited with a civilization subverting. Let's be clear about that. You cannot live a rational life in mile after mile of Los Angeles, despite the beauty of the city, the wonder of the climate. You will be scared, and the people that scaring you are also scared. Let's not dehumanize them, but we have the most. I mean, wherever if you went, then my image of Calcutta before I visited Calcutta, when I finally visited Calcutta, it wasn't that bad, you know. And I'm thinking about it. All these people for the last 50 more years have been trying to claiming to deal with this problem, and then here we are. You weren't even born at that time. To wrap this up, really, I don't want to have just another conversation. People listen to it. Yeah, that's life. You know, we can't feel that way about global warming. We just now had the warmest week we ever had, or something, the warmest month. I don't know. Just saw
Mhm.
the headline. Uh, but you can't have life. Here is San Francisco, which I did report on a bit there. I actually did some work for the Examiner up there many years ago. You know, you have the most valuable real estate in the country with the highest tech, most advanced economy, and it's collapsing because no
Mhm.
one can use the downtown, the whole area. Well,
Mhm.
that's what's happening in Los Angeles, or am I exaggerating?
No. And I think what people can do, what we can do in LA County, is put pressure on the Board of Supervisors and say that, sure, the 1,900 beds in this ACLU settlement is a good start, but it's not enough. I mentioned that RAND report. On the heels of that RAND report, a group of county entities, including community organizations, the sheriff's department, the DA, the Department of Public Health, all came together and created a plan to close Men's Central Jail by rolling out eventually 10,000 community beds, but starting with 2,500. The Board of Supervisors received that report in March of 2021 and then failed to implement it. We're still begging for those beds to come online and getting a court order to get them to do 1,900. But the county has to keep funding the Office of Diversion Reentry, funding beds through the Department of Mental Health to provide these services. If that doesn't happen, we'll continue to see horrific human rights abuses in the jail and continued problems on the street with people who have no place to live and no place to receive the treatment that they need. So that's really what kind of the average LA County person can do, is contact their supervisor and ask, why haven't these plans been followed? When are you going to roll out these beds and community services for people who need mental health treatment pre-trial?
So let me ask you a question, because if it's right now it's a federal problem because the state county's not going to do the right thing. So you've taken your case to the federal court, right?
Right, but there's, the 1,900 beds, it's a great start, but, I think political pressure is going to be what gets the county the rest of the
I'm
way.
aware of that, but also we're here in public radio, KCRW, and Lighton Station in Santa Monica, which has its own homeless
Mhm.
problem, and others can hear this. But I just want to grasp what we're really talking about here, because our federal representatives, they pass big federal budgets addressing a lot of problems, war and peace, new munitions, infrastructure, so forth and so on. Enormous budgets have been passed, and here, when we come to this situation, to find the money to house for instance, the figure here, you have 500 for non-carceral beds for people found incompetent in trial, and 1,700 for people with mental illness. You
Mhm.
say we really need how many right now would we need?
I think the report said eventually 10,000, 2,500 in the first 2 years, and then continually to roll
Okay.
out after that.
Right. And now, how come that just can't compare to say military spending or the money. I mean, that's a joke, and yet it could save. It could save. Let's just be crass capitalists. It could save your city. I mean, you've built all these buildings and highways and everything else, and you can't use the city. And so what I'm
And
trying to get from you is really, why is there resistance? What do the congressional representatives from this community, what
mhm,
do they think when I mean, there's some of them head committee, wasn't it? Nancy Pelosi, for instance, she lives in San Francisco. She's
mhm,
aware of what
mhm,
a nightmare this is. She
right,
could have, after all, the House of Representatives controls the budget.
mhm,
You got other folks down here who have a lot of influence. Our current mayor was a
mhm,
congresswoman, not putting
mhm,
her down or
right,
anything. Adam Schiff, who's running for the Senate, been in the House of Representatives a long time. Why is it so difficult to get the money to build the housing or somehow? And we got to remind people, if these people are not competent to stand trial, or they're people with mental illness, even if even if you have the beds, you've got to clear up this problem. How do they get their case heard?
mhm,
Okay, but
mhm,
we're really talking about a much larger group
mhm,
that, because of the what you exposed here, that
mhm,
they're waiting jailed, and tied to their chair, they
mhm,
are still technically, legally, morally innocent.
yes,
That's
yeah,
what we have. When I kept reading your story, I said, "Wait a minute," you know, and yet we can't find the money. And two things: one, to have a better flow of prisoners and manage their cases, and
mhm,
secondly, have a non-jail alternative to
yes,
the people who need it, so they don't even get to be heard whether they're coherent or not.
mhm,
Instead of being put through this process of making them more incoherent, I got to
mhm,
remind people. And then,
mhm,
secondly, you don't even have the beds to put them somewhere else once you've decided their case and heard them,
mhm,
right?
right, right.
And so, why aren't you driven nuts by this? You seem so
Oh, I
calm. I'm the
am.
one that's babbling here. Let's take this.
No,
No, really, I would like to know. I don't know you personally. I admire what you've done here, and I've babbled on too long. So let's take just another 5 minutes if you have the time, and tell me, how did you get into this? How long have you been doing this? And what have you learned?
right. I've been doing jail conditions work with the ACLU for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was a criminal defense attorney. All of my clients had their cases on appeal and they were indigent. They couldn't afford their own counsel. So I was appointed to represent them on their appeals in the California Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court. So I would often hear from those clients that LA County Jail was the worst place they'd ever been. That they might have stayed in other states or been in prisons in California, up and down California, but LA County was the absolute worst. If they had to go for a sentencing, didn't want to go back to LA County if they could avoid it, it was the worst. And so I was interested in joining ACLU to see if there was some work I could do with that. And because of ACLU's commitment to work not just in the courts, but also with community partners and people who are most directly impacted for political change. Because, I think as we've seen in the settlement, some really great things can happen in the courts. But the rest of the way needs to we only get the whole way there by exercising our political will and convincing the people who are in charge of the purse strings to spend it where it needs to be spent.
So, but a lot of people come out of law school and they go make big bucks for companies. Maybe they do a little pro bono work and so
Mhm,
forth.
mhm,
Uh, but what led you to? I mean, this is grueling work. I mean,
right.
what are you going to get demoralized and sell out, or
I certainly hope not. We do fight for good working conditions in our affiliate too. We want all of us to be able to do good work for the long haul. We unionized recently, so we
the
do
ACLU is?
believe.
Well,
Yes,
that's a good sign.
yes.
Yeah,
So
but just for I teach it right up the street at the University of Southern California, and at the end of the day. I'm in the Annenberg School. A lot of the journalism jobs have dried up.
Mm,
A lot of the smarter, or I shouldn't say smarter,
mhm.
the people who test better. I don't necessarily identify it with intelligence, but seriously, uh, what are they going to do?
Mhm.
Law. That
Yeah.
law is a big catch-all.
Mhm.
And yeah, so we train more and more lawyers, but we are in a more and more just society. And a lot of the lawyers, I'm not putting down our law school. I haven't done an investigation. I don't know the data. But if you take Harvard Law School, most of those people go off and work for Wall Street, or they work for big salaries, or right? They don't. How do we get more people to go work for the ACLU or CARE or public counsel? I mean, there are other good groups around, right?
I think loan forgiveness. If we can, if we can get a commitment to loan forgiveness, I think that's a big deal to be able to get people to be able to do this type of
Okay.
work for the long haul.
And what about affirmative action, which was just struck down?
Right? Yeah. I mean, I went to UCLA law, so under 209, there was already no affirmative action at UCLA, and I think it was poorer for it. I had a good experience, but we had very, very few Latino people, very, very few Black people, and so I think that it would have been different, and it impacts our legal system differently if we have better pipelines. So, those of us in the legal profession, are still committed to widening those pipelines. But, we've seen the damage it's done in California. I'm sad for the damage that it'll do across the country now as well.
And one final dart about the state of media. No, because at least when the LA, I noticed one of the individuals writing this report, Kerry Blankinger. I did a podcast with her, and she had actually served prison time, and was a brilliant writer, and so one of the things is that we have pressure now within the media to be more representative and hire people of
Mhm.
different backgrounds, but the jobs aren't there. The LA Times,
Mhm.
if this story, I think, had been in the old LA Times at the center of its
Mhm.
power, well, on the other hand, it was in 1970s. It still didn't change, but at least we had an idea of accountability of local media. Now the LA Times, it's not their fault, but they're a shadow of the
Mhm.
former self. Uh,
Yeah.
how do you get change if the public? I mean,
I
polls
think.
show people in LA. Let's be fair to LA's population. The public voted to do more for the homeless. The
Mhm.
public has generally, not always, but generally voted to show concern in LA
Mhm.
City, LA County.
Mhm.
They're not getting it. And
Right.
then they get angry because, God, look at all these people sleeping on the street, and look at all these problems, and so forth. And one of the problems is we don't have media coverage.
Right. And I think, it does make a difference to have people in media who have been impacted by the carceral system, because they have a more accurate view of what it's really like inside. As you were saying earlier in this conversation, it's shocking, when you hear what people's experiences are. And I think for most of us in LA County, we don't want to believe that it's as bad. So having people who can elevate the voices of people who are experiencing being without a home, experiencing going through jails, and being only traumatized and made worse, really helps educate the rest of us as to kind of what needs to be done. And as far as voting, we had a really significant election in November, and kicked out the previous sheriff Villanueva, brought in a new sheriff, Sheriff Luna, also kept a liberal supervisor in Lindsay Horvath. And now, in 2023, you need to say, all right, follow through on your promises. The board said they were going to close Men's Central Jail. When and how are you going to do that? They need to set a deadline. They have not. Sheriff Luna has said he wants to comply with all of these various lawsuits, including one the Department of Justice has for treatment of people with mental illness. We got to hold their feet to the fire and make them be good on their promises.
It's a good point in which, and I just want to finally end. Yes, the headline in the LA Times was celebratory. LA County and ACLU, your organization, reach extraordinary agreement to address jail conditions. I will say it is progress,
Right.
and be thankful for that. But here again, quoting the LA Times, under the agreement announced Friday, the LA County Sheriff's Department, which operates the county jails, is barred from holding an inmate in the reception center for longer than 24 hours, or handcuffing or tethering an inmate to an object for more than 4 hours.
Mhm.
Now, I've been around the world, and I've actually spent a little time in a few jails, and I must say, for that to be a victory, again, innocent until proven guilty. These are people who have not been convicted of anything,
Mhm.
tethering an inmate to an object for more than 4 hours. So, okay, imagine tether yourself for 4 hours to see if you
Mhm.
don't go a bit nuts,
Right.
and that they should be able to be processed in less than 24 hours instead of, lying around the floor and urinating on yourself because you can't even get to the bathroom. That's a victory. I want to, my hats off to you for the victory. But I wish people would focus on this more. And
Right.
thanks anyway for taking
Sure.
the time.
Yeah. And,
Okay.
not to end on a low note, but, it's not like this fixed all of the conditions in the jails. I believe we've had at least 25 people die in the jails this year. So the fight is far from over. We need to get thousands more people out of the jail and close the worst offending jail, Men's Central. And that's what I really hope ACLU will get to be a part of that fight for a long time to come.
Well, thank you for doing this. And I also want to thank, I mean, well, you were the main counsel that pushed this, right?
I was one of a group. We also co-counseled with the ACLU National Prison
Oh,
Project. So there were a couple of us in ACLU Southern
right.
California,
Yeah,
and then a couple of people from the National
there
Prison
are a lot of people, and the point you just made, I mean, who's in the jail once you get
Project.
in, and what happens there, and do we have any model for rehabilitating people? I mean, all of these issues that some guy
Mhm.
pushes on, but there are. I don't want to, I don't want to ignore the work that people like you do.
Mhm.
There are a lot of people working, not just
Yes.
in my
Mhm.
case doing an interview for 40 minutes, but really, you hopefully, maybe you'll spend 20, 30 years on this doing this, and the ACLU has been doing that. So even though this has been going on for a long time, it's not that people haven't been fighting over it. I
Mhm.
also want to thank Laura Kondajarian and Christopher Ho at KCRW, which is a the NPR station that does do a lot of good work on this stuff. I want to thank Joshua Scheer, our chief editor, for putting this all together and getting me to know about this case because I didn't know that
Mhm.
there had been this victory until he said, "Look, you got to interview this lawyer." He did that, and we arranged that. So I think I get the L.A. Times. I don't know, somehow I missed the story, but want to thank him. Diego Ramos, who writes the introduction, Max Jones, who does the video, and I want to thank the JKW Foundation in memory of a very strong independent writer, Gene Stein, for giving us some funding to do these shows. See you next week with another edition of Scheer Intelligence.